Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of the Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast on the way. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Season 1 is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey and the 2 years it took to rebuild. It's a really incredible story and features writing and producing from the whole podcast team here at Choice, including Mark Dirks, Sabrina Kofer, and myself. I hope you'll tune in. Patron Driven debuts in late June wherever you get your podcasts. You can visit our website, choice360.org, and click on the Librarianship drop-down to sign up for email updates about Patron Driven. While you're there, you'll find behind-the-scenes bonus content for the new program, and you can check out the new trailer for the upcoming series. Okay, so in the meantime, in the next 4 episodes of this podcast, we're going to be talking about how librarians can support critical thinking in an era of misinformation and fake news. If you're thinking information literacy, you'd be correct, but this is not your traditional approach to info-lit. My guests have all built their own programming and instruction that is specifically aimed at combating today's fire hose of alternative facts, faulty research, and the digital technologies that enable them. We'll discuss their specific approaches, how they constructed their workshops and lessons, and how the traditional approach to info-lit instruction may be changing for good. My guests are Sarah Morris, Head of Instruction and Engagement at Emory University Libraries, Dan Chibnall, STEM Librarian and Assistant Professor of Librarianship at Drake University, Roz Tedford, Director of Research and Instruction at Wake Forest University, and Mila Steele, Senior Publisher, Social Sciences at Sage Publishing. This series is brought to you by Sage Publishing. In this first of our 4 episodes, my guests and I explore the context around the whys and hows of setting up info-lit instruction. We look at the various kinds of misinformation out there, how it impacts student research, and some of the ways social media and other digital technologies impact the way people receive their information. Okay, Sarah, Dan, Roz, and Mila, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just wanted to kick it off, and with some context around, around info-lit and misinformation. And I'm wondering, Roz, we'll start with you. What are the kinds of misinformation that are swirling around out there currently, and how are they impacting student research?
So I think there's several kinds that are concerning me predominantly at the moment. And one of those is simply students not being aware that their searches as they're out searching in Google or Wikipedia or wherever actually they're out there searching, how much algorithms sort of control that, and how the search results that they're getting are not necessarily based on any sort of judgment about quality or authority of the source, and how difficult it's becoming to determine actually what is an advertisement, right? What is a conspiracy theory? What is actually legitimate information from an academic source, because of what I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, which is a phenomenon called container collapse. So I think the unawareness of authority out there is one of the things that worries me the most. I'm sure Dan and Sarah have other concerns.
And Dan, how about you? Would you agree with that?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I see quite often is the problem of students don't really understand that what they're seeing is basically the result of, like Roz said, computers and not human activity. And so what we end up seeing is that students are simply pulling things down that basically confirmation bias. So they find a result that agrees with them, and so they use that. And then you just have sort of a snowball effect. And so they don't see things that disagree. They don't see things that make them critically think. They simply just identify something that looks like what they need, and then they just simply use it. And so there's the speed of it happening really has an impact on the quality of the results that they put in there.
Right. And then Sarah, over to you. I mean, would you say that is this actually making its way into the research, or is there some sort of midpoint? Without the instruction and programming that all of you are providing. I mean, are you seeing some of this actually making it into the research?
I would think so to some degree.
Yeah.
I would say I work a good bit with undergraduate students, and to Dan's point, people are with the speed and just sort of pulling things down without really critically thinking about it or understanding what it is and where it came from. There's a definite, I've seen a sort of lack of understanding about how, say, algorithms work and why you're seeing what you're seeing and sort of what different sources and methods of production for information are. So I think that all contributes to some of the issues you might see where someone is just using a source. They're not really quite understanding what it is, but it sounds good enough or it meets their need well enough, and they're just pulling it down. So there's, I think, a level of sort of superficial results being yanked as well. I mean, we've heard people so rarely go past the first page of Google results and things like that in an environment right. where the information's so fast and there's so much out there and there's such a wide array of quality and what different things are. I think that can just be really challenging, particularly for less experienced researchers and undergraduates to sift through that and make informed decisions about the sources they want to use.
Right. Excellent. And then Mila, I'm curious, what's the perspective on the publisher side on this? I mean, what are you paying attention to? Are there specific ways you're, constructing your content or your products and that sort of, nod towards this issue in certain ways?
Well, a lot of what we publish are textbooks, which are designed as resources to help students learn better and find information and use information to drive their assignments and contributions, essays, research projects. And at Sage, we're especially focused on research methods. It's one of our biggest flagship lists. And so we're pouring a ton of attention into sort of through statistical literacy and other research methods, kind of focused teaching, training, textbook development, to really try and be very explicit with students and make sure that they understand what data are and where they come from, sort of to really help inject that into the kind of student learning process as well, so that students are kind of going through their research projects, going through their learning, particularly at the undergraduate level, and are there understanding and learning how to assess and sift information and data properly in every course that they do.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. So I think one particular hang up, and I think several of you have addressed this slightly in terms of finding results that kind of jibe with what they believe or already are thinking. People have always kind of believed falsehoods. Flat earthers, for example, have been around forever. I mean, how or why does misinformation or disinformation seem like such an existential threat right now in this moment? And Dan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think it's, as you put it, an existential threat because, people have had these kind of beliefs for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that they were never able to find each other. And so you could have been in a small community or even a big city and had an offbeat belief in something. But where are you going to go to find other people? The post office, the library, you're not going to find those people. And then comes the internet. So now you have social media, you have Reddit, you have, 4chan, whatever those things might be. And now those people have a sort of confidence in their belief systems because they're no longer alone. They can go out and find other people who believe the same thing, and that breeds more confidence in the ideas. And so then they become more entrenched in those beliefs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Roz, anything you want to add to that?
We talk in the classes that we teach a lot about that exact concept that Dan was talking about, which is the long tail, right? That it used to be those people that were on the fringes of whatever had a hard time finding each other, which meant for slower transmission, more laborious transmissions, you had to whatever join up, like subscribe to a magazine that was about the moon landing hoax or whatever. And one of the beauties of the internet is that it's let communities find each other, right, across time and distance. But one of the bad things is when your community is a conspiracy theory community or a hate group or whatever, that speed at which you can find other people, and then it lends itself to things like the cascade effect and those sorts of things, where the mere illusion of credibility comes from the sheer number of people out there who are saying it's true, and so it sort of feeds off each other, just as Dan was saying. And one of the things that keeps conspiracy theories going is that you feel like you're an insider,
Yeah.
right? That you're in an insider group and you have a secret that no one else knows, and that's exactly what the internet is really great at propagating, unfortunately.
Very true. Sarah, I'm curious, or any of you really, I mean, are you literally seeing some of this popping up in your instruction? I mean, are you actually combating this while you're teaching your classes?
Definitely sometimes. I will say that I found my students to be sort of increasingly aware that this is an issue and curious about it as well. I think that I like to say the internet kind of went on a collision course with how we've sort of processed information, our belief systems over thousands of years, and just sort of exacerbate certain tendencies in all of us. And Roz, I like what you mentioned about the internet, the conspiracy theories. It helps you feel in the know, and the internet can sort of heighten that, because I think the sort of personalization of the internet too can be a wonderful thing. If you want to find a restaurant nearby, it's helpful if it knows where you are, but it can also backfire in that you could be in a sort of conspiracy theory community, and then you're in this filter bubble space, and that's all you're seeing and hearing, and it's just kind of reinforcing those views. So I've found that students are, it does come up in classes for me, and people are kind of interested not just in misinformation itself, but in how our entire media and internet ecosystem is actually functioning right now, and why you're seeing what you're seeing, which is something we talk a lot about. I've had more discussions about that, but I'd be curious if others have had different sorts of experiences with their students, obviously, and some of these sort of beliefs coming up in an instruction session or what have you.
I always seem to have students that say they have a relative that believes some of these wacky things, right? So I always ask not necessarily whether they believe them. I'm like, but do y'all all know somebody out there who, whatever that conspiracy theory is at the time? Right now, it's that coronavirus is a hoax or right or whatever. Then you do see a lot of sort of heads nodding like, oh yeah, crazy Uncle Joe or whatever is out there. So they definitely, you won't admit it necessarily for themselves, but it seems like they all maybe know of someone who thinks that.
Right. Yeah.
I see it in my fake news class, like this past January. I think it depends on how often they hear it, or because it's sort of like the more they hear something, the more then they might believe in it, or they might kind of think about that. And so like we had a couple examples this past January where one of the students brought up the birds aren't real conspiracy theory, that all birds died in the 60s, and that all birds that we see nowadays are robots that the government uses to spy on us. Now, nobody in the class believed
what?
that. They said, no, this is ridiculous. But then when we got into the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing, there were a couple of people in class who were like, there's a lot to think about there. And so I think it's because they hear it more in the news, or they see it more in their social media feeds. The bird thing they don't see as much, but the Epstein thing they see way more of. So then they're really thinking about it and spending more time on it.
Yeah. So this is a good segue into the next question, and that is, what are some of the ways social media and or other digital technologies are impacting the way people receive and process information? And Roz, you earlier mentioned container collapse, and I don't know really what container collapse is, and I'm thinking that maybe it fits into this question. So
Sure. So the idea of container collapse is that term is something that I've heard more and more in the last couple of years, but it's that idea that when you're doing a search, and this is true whether you're on a Google search or whether you're in like an Uber search, like a like a Summon or whatever, or even some other vendor product that has a bunch of different formats, that the results all look the same, right? It's all single lines, headline, and so you can't really tell necessarily, and whether that's an ad or whether it's a promoted link or whether it's a journal article or a newspaper article or a book, and all of those different types of content have specific places in a student's research or faculty's research life. And if you can't tell that what you're looking at is an opinion piece from the New York Times versus a scholarly journal article just by looking at the search results, then that's a problem, because you may be just as likely, right, to think that the opinion piece is fact, not understanding what it actually is. And Google keeps making their distinction between ads and regular results less and less distinguishable, and it's true on other places as well. So that's sort of that idea that everything is starting to look alike, and that it really takes a lot more effort to determine who is the authority behind it and whether you should believe them.
Right. And then I would think like social media in particular would kind of comport to what some of you were saying just earlier, that how sort of believing in a certain conspiracy, you're sort of in the know and you feel sort of part of an exclusive group. I think a lot of the way that a lot of people set up their social media and who they follow are people who think just like them. So I think that I would guess that would compound the effect of some of these more wacky left fringy beliefs that bubble to the surface.
In your question, you mentioned how people process information from social media. And one thing we talk about in my course is that they're not processing it. They see stuff in social media and it's more like a symbol, like a meme or a piece of short writing. It's no longer something to be necessarily digested or thought about, but rather just recognized, like this is a part of my tribe or this is not part of my tribe. And social media is always on. It's easily digestible. It's fast. And, it's basically always awake. And so because of the speed at which the information is delivered to people, they can scroll through it so quickly that they're not really thinking about it. They're just more recognizing it. And if it's something that they recognize and they see it more often, then it has more of an imprint on their mind. They're not really thinking about it. They're more just sort of glancing at it. And it sort of just becomes sort of an object or a symbol.
So it kind of has a reinforcement effect, I would think, then.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with the algorithms in something like Facebook, where you're seeing more and more of what Facebook thinks you want to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Dan, we talk about that some in my class as well. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think too there's sort of reactivity to social media. You're scrolling and seeing things so quickly, and a lot of times, especially within misinformation, the language can be fairly inflammatory, or the image can trigger some sort of very strong emotional reaction. And it's very, very easy to react by retweeting and sharing and spreading it further, or liking something very quickly. And that sort of act itself almost reinforces your space in this group you might feel an affinity with. So I think all of that can contribute, again, to the speed and the spread of these things and the way these things can get entrenched within people's minds.
Mm-hmm. Roz, I wanted to come back to you on this question, and that is, how does bad research seep into popular culture? Vaccinations are an obvious example here. How does that actually work? And I guess this is sort of we're going to flip the model here from what we were just discussing earlier about sort of how social media and digital technologies are influencing the way people think and process information. Here we have an example, perhaps, where a piece of research is already out there, and it's a piece of bad research, and somehow it's made it into it's influencing the way people are thinking about certain things.
Right. So it's interesting that you asked this question, because we just had we've had to take my first year seminar online over the last few weeks. And last week was the entire week was on what we call sort of junk science, which is both bad science, right, and also bad reporting on science. And one of the byproducts of sort of a shrinking paid journalist model, right? Where there are fewer newspapers, fewer and fewer news outlets out there that are making enough money to pay their journalists, is that the science reporters aren't as sort of deeply knowledgeable about science. So the reporting gets to be can be pretty bad even if the science itself is good. So suddenly, right, there's a headline that says, drinking, a glass of red wine is the same as exercising for 45 minutes, which is of course not what that study said at all, but it got covered everywhere. But then I did a big long case study on the fact that the Wakefield autism study was horrible science, right? And it let us talk about peer review and the Lancet and what a critical journal that was, and then how it got uncovered, which not coincidentally was by a really great science journalist, and how it got exposed and all of those sorts of things. And one of the questions we started out with on that is, what do you know about the anti-vax debate? And all of the students had some sort of personal thing. They had an aunt, they had a friend, they had a teacher at school, that they had some popular story, some story out of their own experience about that one very particular thing. And we sort of try and help them understand that while the red wine equals an hour of exercise, right, is not necessarily harmful. It's the same sort of product as the vaccines cause autism reporting that happened after the Wakefield study. And you need to be cautious and warn against both the ridiculous, right, and the really damaging as you see that news reporting on science.
Right. And Dan, I know you spend some time as well in your programming, sort of discerning between sources as well.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And I'll touch on that question for a moment too. That it doesn't always take a retraction, of something to basically make the problem go away. It just takes one instance of a bad piece of research or a misreported piece of research to basically start an avalanche. It's not like a system of like linking evidence in a court case, where if you find out, oh, this is fruit of a poison tree, oh, well then, case closed. When something like this happens, and like the Lancet piece got out there, the Wakefield piece, it doesn't matter anymore that Wakefield's thing was retracted, because it's basically put something into motion that is very hard to stop. So even if you tell people like, hey, this origin point, it was wrong, they're like, what? Who cares? Because they've already heard all this other stuff that's been put into motion. And that's what's really dangerous about when we look at some of these sources and discern between them, like, yeah, this one is bad. This is an example of a good one. But the bad one can still create a massive impact years after it's been shown to be bad. So yeah, it's very hard to stop these things in their tracks because they basically take on a life of their own.
That's an excellent point. Sarah, I wanted to see if you could give us like a sense of how interdisciplinary the issue of misinformation really is. I mean, this isn't just a science thing or a journalism thing. What other ways are you seeing this all creep into various disciplines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's incredibly interdisciplinary. I'd say in the way that, information literacy itself is incredibly interdisciplinary. It touches every single aspect of different types of research we do in different subjects, and misinformation and the challenges it poses with, finding credible sources and critically evaluating information is something that I think really touches literally everyone's lives and every kind of field of research and arena. Often, we've been talking about junk science, and those are often really critical examples to consider, particularly with the trust issue that can come into play and how that can erode trust in science. And I think in the sort of COVID-19 pandemic situation we're in now, we're seeing more and more of that. But you see misinformation issues with civic engagement and civic life. There's examples in the realm of business. Historians are grappling with it. I'm an English librarian, and it comes up there. I mean, it's just all over the place and everywhere. And so I think that, considering it as an interdisciplinary issue that affects everyone can, I think, be powerful and help, empower people to better recognize it and grapple with it, and as opposed to sort of siloing it off and like, well, this is a science problem, it doesn't affect my field. It definitely does. It affects everyone.
You just heard from Sarah Morris, Head of Instruction and Engagement at Emory University Libraries, Dan Chibnall, STEM Librarian and Assistant Professor of Librarianship at Drake University, Roz Tedford, Director for Research and Instruction at Wake Forest University, and Mila Steele, Senior Publisher of Social Sciences at Sage Publishing. This series is brought to you by Sage Publishing. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about how each of our guests approach their info-led instruction, what they focus on, and how they conduct their workshops and courses.
I try to remind my students, no matter what situation we're in, that these skills of like spotting misinformation and dealing with it aren't just academic. Like these are skills you're going to take out into the world and you're going to have to use time and again, because we're seeing misinformation more and more. So it's not just something they're learning for their courses or for their own research, but really to train their minds for when they leave college as well.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.